I won't have the recording yet.
Andy, I think let's roll.
Folks. All right. Sounds good to me. Let me this back around. All right. Well, welcome everybody to this is our 5th in the Conversations in Transportation series. Again, welcome. My name is Andy Wagner from HNTB. We refer to me as the producer, I guess is the term that Joe has taken a liking to for it. For this series. Again, just want to thank everybody for taking some time out of their day for attending this webinar. We're all very excited to welcome Susan Howard from AASHTO. Just a couple of quick reminders. First of all, if you have questions that come up in your head during any point of the presentation, we have to use the Q&A function here in Zoom in order to ask your questions. We do that instead of the chat box because it's easier for us to keep track of the questions, make sure that we've answered everything that's come through. That's first announcement. Second, after the presentation this afternoon, you will receive a link in your email to the PDH and evaluation forms, which you can fill out online, but we'll also provide a link for a physical copy if you want to fill it out and scan it in. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Joe Hummer.
Great, Andy, thank you. And would you like to be called executive producer or what?
No, producer is fine. Maybe executive producer next year.
There you go. There you go. I really do appreciate your help with this. It wouldn't be possible without you. And thanks to the Strategic Initiative Council and the Young Members Council for sponsoring this series. That's Adam Fisher of SIC and Christina Whitfield of the Young Members Council. Really appreciate your help with this as well. The purpose of our series is to help educate our members through a series of conversations with transportation industry leaders or trying for interesting people, interesting careers, topics, ideas, and hoping to that you all transportation professionals of all ages and job titles can gain something from these conversations. Thanks to our sponsors, the Gold and Diamond sponsor companies who make this series possible and indeed make most of what we do at Nixite possible. Really appreciate that. Evaluation forms and PDH certificates Andy mentioned. And so without further ado, let's get into it. And oh, by the way, I'm Joe Hummer, the Nixite president and state traffic management engineer at NCDOT. Happy to be here with you. We are talking about federal funding for transportation today, and our guest is Susan Howard, the program director for the transportation finance at AASHTO. She's also director of the BATIC Institute, an AASHTO Center of Excellence. She advocates on behalf of the nation's state departments of transportation for long-term sustainable transportation funding and expansion of those financing tools. She previously was program manager for freight at AASHTO. Prior to joining AASHTO, she was director of government relations for the National Association of Development Organizations. She was a federal programs coordinator for NCDOT and worked at Capitol Hill as a legislative assistant as well. Susan earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Guilford College in Greensboro. So indeed, North Carolina native or just passing native. Okay, good. So
basically, yeah.
Yeah, basically. Thanks again for joining us today. And we were chatting before about the timing of this conversation, that when we were kind of planning this a couple months ago, we had no idea where we'd be in the legislative cycle, that we'd be right in the middle of it. Holy mackerel. So please give us the latest with the so-called infrastructure bill.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real kick and a pleasure for me to speak to some home state folks. Yes, I moved to North Carolina when I was about a year old, so I consider myself a native.
Yeah.
And yeah, so absolutely, the timing here is very fortuitous. There is a lot going on, and I think things are changing hour by hour. But we are kind of staring down the barrel here of a vote before Thursday or on Thursday for the infrastructure bill, the big infrastructure bill, which is the what we call the IIJA, also known as the BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework or Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. It's had a lot of different names, but once it passed the Senate, I think IIJA is where we stuck or we finished off. So really, this has been an ongoing series of negotiations with another large piece of President Biden's legislative agenda, another $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation package, which includes a lot of other federal spending outside of transportation and infrastructure. There's some transportation infrastructure, but largely it's focused on more human needs and human capital priorities. So there's been an attempt to kind of run these as hand in hand initiatives and pass them as part of this wide sweeping legislative agenda for the president and the new administration. But it's becoming clear that transportation has a more pressing deadline, in that the FAST Act extension that we're currently operating under expires on September 30th. So within the last 12, 15 hours, it seems that the two have been decoupled, and they're going to try to move infrastructure on its own before Thursday and save us the pain of a lapse in the ability to collect and serve revenue and reimburse states under the Highway Trust Fund.
So that is really late breaking news, and I guess good to hear. So the size of the IIJA, it's been around $1 trillion, and maybe getting a little less than that as time goes by. But can you give us the kind of broad outlines of what's in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been a little difficult to parse out the $1 trillion because so much of the spending is sort of, you count the 5-year reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Bill as part of that $1 trillion. You count additional appropriations for USDOT. Of that $1 trillion, over half of it is transportation spending, and that's because it includes that 5-year Surface reauthorization bill. But there's also money for broadband and energy, but transportation certainly is the biggest chunk of the IIJA, and why it's been so significant for our industry to move it forward.
Okay. Is it going to pass on Thursday?
Well, right now there's a real kind of tug of war going on between, okay, let me back up a little bit. It's passed the Senate. In the House, there's been sort of a tug of war within the Democratic Party, moderates versus progressives, about this passage of this bill and how that plays into passage of this larger $3.5 trillion, budget reconciliation package. Unfortunately, the House Republicans have decided to whip against the bill. I think that there's maybe not universal support for that within particularly Republicans who serve on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Now, keep in mind, the House didn't really have any say in this bill. The House had their own transportation bill, largely written by House Democrats, that passed independently. And that's kind of been just set aside because the kind of unusual framework that was used, the bipartisan framework that was used to develop this bipartisan bill in the Senate, kind of happened outside of the traditional committee structure. Luckily, we already had a surface transportation bill that had passed through the Senate Committee of Jurisdiction that could be kind of the main vehicle for this IIJA. But for a lot of House members, they don't have any stake in it. It wasn't their bill, and that goes for both House Democrats and Republicans. So there's a group of House moderates that are very determined to pass this bill. There are a group of House progressives who have said we don't want to do infrastructure unless it's going hand in hand with the larger budget reconciliation package. So right now, I think it's a matter of vote counting. And Speaker Pelosi is really good at that. Nothing will get to a vote if the votes aren't there. So I imagine that that's what's happening behind the scenes now. Is trying to come up to that kind of magic. I think 221 is the number that has to pass, somewhere around there. So you're counting all the votes. You're trying to build a coalition that can get it passed.
And then does it have to go back to the Senate or to a conference committee, or is it pretty much?
No. What in normal times we would have a House passed bill, a Senate passed bill, a conference. What the House is considering this week is essentially just what the Senate has passed over. And early on, it was clear that this was not going to necessarily be a negotiable situation. So that again kind of goes back to some of the frustration that members of the House are feeling about this, that they didn't really have a say. Some of their priorities aren't getting met, but conversely, a lot of their priorities are going to get met through this much larger budget reconciliation package. So it kind of did end up being a take it or leave it proposition. Mm-hmm. When you have the Senate and the White House behind something, it's kind of 2 against 1 now. So the House just didn't have a lot of leverage in terms of wanting to rewrite the bill, or as I said, in a normal situation, we might have had a conference, but this was definitely an unusual path for this bill to move forward.
Does Asheville support this bill up on Thursday?
We do. Yeah, we do. We're supportive. It checks a lot of boxes for things that we had prioritized specifically. Mm-hmm. I mean, if it didn't have the long-term surface reauthorization, I think it would be a lot more difficult for us to support it as just sort of additional infrastructure spending outside of the context of reauthorization. Reauthorization is so important to our members, but yeah, it includes 5 years of predictable revenue. It has a lot of important policy changes, and it has formula funding, which our states, over 90% of the bill is formula funding, which is important to state DOTs. So yes, it kind of lines up with our core policy principles in terms of funding and policy stability.
Right. It must be a little bit odd, though, in the way you're describing the House members too, that usually at this later stage of a bill, this is your area, not me, but you tell me if I'm wrong here, but usually there's a lot of give and take and negotiation, and Asheville, among others, would be in there, fully participating in this. And this the way you're describing it here, we are sort of more on the sidelines, kind of cheering it on, but not really negotiating it out. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I would say that, groups like Asheville had a lot of input when the surface reauthorization bill that moved to the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee was coming to be. That's called ATIA. Again, too many acronyms that people don't necessarily need to know. But so there was that standalone bill, and we had a lot of input in that. Worked very closely with the Senate over really 2 years, because again, this bill, we did this last year, and then we got to September 30th of 2020 when the FAST Act expired and it wasn't ready. So we did a year-long extension. So a lot of groundwork was laid over the past 2 years. So we certainly felt like in that process, we had a lot of input. And then what ended up happening was that you kind of had as I said, you had the surface reauthorization as the kind of base, and then you have general appropriations, additional appropriations money kind of layered on top. So it is unusual, and is unusual structure than what we're used to. And on the House side, the House moved their own bill called the Invest Act, and it had some things we liked and some things that we weren't as crazy about. But again, that was a process and going back and forth, working with the committee for many, many months. So yeah, in some ways it's a little bit of a, again, it just speaks to the unusual nature of this cycle and this process.
Sure. Yep. And it'd be interesting to see whether this unusual nature this time becomes the norm going out.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, there'll be some interesting lessons learned, I think, from this in terms of, I guess my kind of existential question is, without the support of the White House, without this bipartisan group of senators, would we have even gotten to this point? Mm-hmm. I think I have my doubts that Congress would have been able to pull it together to do a quote unquote normal reauthorization bill. So maybe it was this confluence of factors that kind of had to happen to get it to where we are today.
And if it does pass, we'll take it then.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of good to be done with the bill if it passes.
How does North Carolina fare if the bill passes on Thursday?
Well, I think you can, a couple of different things I'll mention. First of all, North Carolina will fare well in terms of, it's funding over 5 years. I think the total is close to 7.5 billion in formula funding, divided among the core programs. And there are 2 new core programs established in the infrastructure bill, in the surface reauthorization framework. One of the other kind of big things about this bill, though, is that there's a lot of discretionary funding, meaning funding decisions, grant programs administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation that states and localities, to an extent, will be competing for. So that, to me, is the biggest unknown. And I know that our friends at North Carolina DOT have tried to do a little bit of work in guesstimating what that revenue might look like. Of course, that's important for our program, for doing forecasting, to kind of have a sense of what federal resources will be able to apply to our state's program. So it's a little tricky. I mean, some of it is very clear cut. Like we have plenty of apportionment tables that show breakdown by breakdown how each state will fare. What's a little bit more unknown is the year-to-year appropriations, which might be a little bit more up or down depending, and that discretionary funding. That will be a big sea change in terms of the amount of money that USDOT will be responsible for getting out through a discretionary process, or just processes, because there's going to be multiple programs.
Mm-hmm. And from NCDOT perspective, sharpen our pencils and get ready to write some grant applications.
Yeah, I would give that advice to every state DOT if this bill passes. Even if you've never gone in the big established discretionary programs, infra and what used to be called Tiger or Build, now called Raise. Those have been the 2 discretionary programs ever since we did away with the earmarks. And states have competed for those in many times successfully, but it's been a highly competitive and oversubscribed program. So, states have had to make a calculus. Is it worth putting the resources into this, not knowing that we'll get anything back from it? I think with the level of the real boom we're going to see in discretionary funding, every state is going to want to be participating. Right. And I imagine that there will be, if not direct, if not direction that every state should get a portion of this, there'll be political considerations that go into account where you'll want it to be you'll want to be well represented in making sure that the money is spread pretty widely across the state. So every state, I think, should be in a position of thinking about how they're going to do that.
Good. We chatted earlier that my notion of North Carolina as a donor state is kind of old-fashioned, and I need to sort of rethink that. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I would only just say, yes, certainly a lot of folks here probably on this call remember the whole donor state debate in previous surface reauthorization bills. And it was certainly a part of the debate when I was working on Capitol Hill. In some ways, it's a little bit of a relic because so much of the revenue that's going into the program now is from general fund transfers. So that we do have input, there is a trigger in place. If a state reaches a certain percentage, 95%, if you get to that point and you're putting in more than that, then you're getting back. There is a mechanism by which something triggers and you get a recalculation. But Texas has been the only state that has faced that in recent years. So in some ways, it's almost like the parameters have shifted enough that the old kind of donor-donee state dichotomy is not as prevalent. There is, however, I think a bigger conversation about our current formulas. And I'll say this as speaking from maybe just from Susan Howard's perspective and not necessarily AASHTO's. Our members don't have a real appetite right now for opening up the formula distribution program. And I mean, it would create a lot of headaches. There would be a situation where you're winners versus losers. It would be complex, but I do think that our numbers are the formula program is kind of frozen in time, frozen in amber from 2005. They haven't touched it. So there have been a lot of demographic changes across our country since then. And one thing that was included in various iterations of the infrastructure bill, we'll see if it ends up in the final version, was a study between AASHTO and Federal Highway Administration and USDOT on, our current formula distribution model and how it could or should be updated. So again, all of that is said just to say that we're kind of in this agree to just kind of go with it for now because of the problems it might cause by opening up that kind of Pandora's box.
Got enough other things to worry about, right?
Yeah, right. And again, I think our members feel like stability and predictability right
Yep.
now is maybe a greater concern and a greater goal than quote unquote fairness, if
Right.
that makes sense.
Right. So it seems from your comments so far that we are moving maybe away from what were considered to be user fees or user charges toward more general funding sources for transportation. Is that fair?
Yes, well, we are dependent upon general fund sources now to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent and meet its obligations. So this infrastructure bill includes a $118 billion transfer from the general fund to the Highway Trust Fund for the life cycle of the next 5 years. So yeah, we're in that. That's the approach. Congress hasn't had any appetite for other revenue right now, at least. And so, yeah, I don't see that changing necessarily in the short term. So yeah, and so then again, it just begins to kind of dilute that user pay principle that we've all kind of clung to for a long time. So things are shifting, and they have been for many years, as long as we're continuing to prop up the trust fund with general fund revenue.
Yeah, gas tax increase seems like the third rail at this point.
Yeah.
Are they increasing or encouraging more experiments with the per mile charges?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of action at the state level. I'll kind of divide it up to like what's going on sort of the state level and then the national level. We've had a grant program in place since the last bill, reauthorization bill, to support state innovation in that area, looking at alternative revenue. So we've had a number of pilot projects across the country looking at collecting revenue through a mileage-based fee, a vehicle miles traveled tax fee. And we have 2 operational programs right now in Oregon and Utah. Utah has switched to a VMT for alternative fuel vehicles. I mean, users have a choice, and they're looking to phase in other classes of the fleet. And Oregon has a program that does collect revenue. So we've seen it. I think there's been a lot of important work done at the state level that can inform the national conversation. And there's language in this bill to do a national pilot on VMT. And, what that will look like, I think, is still to be determined. AASHTO has passed a policy resolution where we kind of lay out what some of the principles would be. And to me, the biggest thing is sort of like, there is a lot we've learned from the states that we don't necessarily need to replicate. But there are certain, I would say, collection methodologies, data sharing, big picture issues that if we were going to move to a VMT, if we were going to switch from a gasoline tax to a VMT at the national level, would require a lot of very thoughtful work and involve other agencies like, the Department of Treasury, who would have to be the revenue collector. So I think that having a national pilot program will help move the needle. But I still think we're probably years away.
Right. Next bill anyway.
Yeah, you want to lay some groundwork now and make some progress and figure out what, I think I would even say and I do think that is one area where I think the tide has changed on Capitol Hill in terms of a willingness to at least look at it. You won't necessarily hear every member say that we know this is the way forward, but and again, across party lines too. I mean, one of the biggest champions of that has been the ranking member on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, a Republican from Missouri, who has said, I think this is the way of the future and we need to start making progress towards that. So it is one thing I think that we will see significant federal attention to.
Good. Funding by mode. President Biden is famous for being a rail person, and indeed, just from the kind of headlines, it looks like rail is going to be sort of a big winner out of this bill. Is that accurate?
Yes, there is a lot of revenue in this bill for rail, $66 billion, I believe, and I think some of that is for state-supported service. A lot of it is going to be for the Amtrak Northeast Corridor, which makes sense in some ways. I mean, it is our most sort of it's our most used and it's our most advanced in terms of its, what's the right word, sort of independence, self-sustainability. But there is also a lot of money for intercity passenger rail at the state level. And of course, North Carolina has a stellar passenger rail program, and a lot of states do as well. So that's the state supported routes are really important for state DOTs and that partnership with Amtrak. So there'll be a lot of new money for intercity passenger rail. I think a lot of states will be looking at improving their service or starting new service or bringing back service. We have some state supported routes that over the past decade or two have folded, and there's a desire to bring them back. So certainly that will be a big focus. Even more so too, there's on the budget reconciliation side too, I think there's going to be a push for rail and transit there. In general, I don't think the transit advocates were super happy with what got included in the infrastructure bill. And that was one area where the overall number went down during the negotiations. So they're now looking at the reconciliation package as an opportunity to do a little bit more on transit.
And how about pedestrian and bicycle? Anything?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly some new programs within the infrastructure bill that want to kind of look at complete streets, or sort of like a holistic approach, making sure that pedestrians are included in the planning process and the design of our system. The Transportation Alternatives Program continues. So yeah, I think that will continue to also be a big focus, and in that kind of quality of life, livability focus of the administration as well.
Good. Let's talk a little bit about the reconciliation bill that is advancing. As you said, they're being uncoupled, the two bills, but the reconciliation is certainly not going away. So any more that you see for transportation in that one?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Reconciliation is a really unusual, complex in some ways process where essentially every committee gets a dollar amount and is charged with figuring out how to use it. And because it is tied to the budget process, it is very much driven by spending and not policy. So new programs, a high focus on new programs or plussing up existing programs. Now, what was interesting about how the budget reconciliation conversation kind of tied into infrastructure is that there was this deal, this agreement to not double dip, quote unquote, meaning if there was a big push in the infrastructure bill for a certain category of spending, we don't want to also do that. We don't want to open up that negotiation again and go back to it in budget reconciliation. So, for example, you have the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. It got from the budget committee, the House Budget Committee, like $57.3 billion, and spend it how you wish, but no double dipping. So what ended up happening is that the chairman of that committee, had to find a way to give money to priorities and programs that he supported. And again, I say this as budget reconciliation is kind of by its nature a partisan endeavor, because the reason you do it is because you're trying to get past the need for 60 votes in the Senate. So it's kind of a backdoor way. It can only be done once per fiscal years, and we did it once earlier. And so now, again, it does kind of end up being driven by the party in power, not necessarily taking into account a full bipartisan process. So when I say that, the chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee kind of had in mind his priorities, that's pretty much how it played out. So, there was a lot of focus there on transit, on a new mobility and housing program that would kind of be a joint DOT and HUD effort. A lot of, again, more passenger rail funding, more transit stuff. Again, things that you couldn't necessarily weren't necessarily handled through the infrastructure package, but were priorities for Chairman DeFazio. And another big one that might be of interest to folks is sort of a placeholder for earmarks. As you may remember, the House bill included earmarks, the House infrastructure, the reauthorization bill, surface transportation reauthorization, and then but the Senate did not. So when the Senate base became the IIJA, there were no earmarks in that package. But Chairman DeFazio had gone through this whole process of getting $6 billion of earmarks identified and put into his bill. So what he's done is kind of carved out a placeholder in budget reconciliation. Now, whether it will pass the smell test, I don't know. I have my doubts if the Senate parliamentarian will say that that's okay. But again, they have essentially, that's one thing that they've used their money for, is to like set aside this amount for earmarks. And then on the other side, on the financing side, the House Ways and Means Committee is establishing some new bonding programs, building on things that we used to have in the past, like the Build America Bonds program. So there are transportation related spending through budget reconciliation, but it is not as sort of deep or comprehensive as the infrastructure bill.
I'm chuckling because I'm old enough to remember when earmarks were a thing and then they were gone and now they're back.
Yeah, potentially back. Yeah.
Yeah. What a bet on what do they really do? Yeah. The reconciliation bill is then uncoupled and in some way it's lagging behind, but AASHTO supports it.
I don't know if we've taken an official position yet, to be honest with you. We've been so focused on the infrastructure bill. And we have been mindful of how they are playing parallel. So it's clear what our priority is. And so I don't know at this point if we've said definitively one way or the other. So I probably can't speak to it.
Sure. No, that makes sense too. Sometimes silence speaks.
Yeah, sometimes you got to hold back a little bit before when other things are more pressing.
Yep. What would be your bet at this point? Will it pass eventually? Will we get the reconciliation bill?
I think so. I think there's a lot of drama around it right now, and really what they have to do is get the Senate to agree to an overall number. Again, keep in mind, like this, you got to have the votes in the Senate, and our Senate is so evenly divided right now. And so some of those moderate Democrats who were key to development of the infrastructure bill are, they're kind of concerned about the size. So essentially you kind of have to get the House and the Senate on the same page over an overall number. And then you get down in the weeds of each committee's allocation and how they spend it. So there's still a lot of work to be done on reconciliation. There's also no pressing timetable the way there is with the infrastructure bill, given the expiration of the FAST Act extension. So there is more time to get it done, but I can understand where, some folks are coming from with, if the pressure's not on, you got to keep the pressure up, and, having the infrastructure bill as a leverage to getting more progress made on reconciliation is certainly going to be some people's priority.
The 2022 election will probably be start to loom pretty soon. So, eventually that deadline will pop up there.
Yep.
It is, I know some of our members have expressed a concern about the growing federal debt, especially in relation to the reconciliation bill. Is that part of the discussion that you hear in DC? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's particularly come up lately with the debt ceiling. So, we periodically have to raise the debt. The Congress has to raise the debt ceiling, and the House's approach was to tie that to the continuing resolution for fiscal year 22 appropriation. So, but that kind of hit a roadblock in the Senate, and they're not willing to engage on it yet. So again, that's also another thing that has more time, like that we're not going to hit the debt ceiling tomorrow. So you may decouple it from a continuing resolution, and a continuing resolution is not usually very hard to pass. Sometimes we've had government shutdowns, of course, in the past few years. But I don't think they're particularly helpful for either side. So the will usually is to get, to keep the government functioning. But the debt limit certainly threw a little bit of a wrench in that this week. So I think they'll probably end up being separated. But yeah, we are spending a lot of money, and this came up during the COVID debate too. The COVID relief debate is sort of just like, we are throwing a lot of money at issues, but we also are at a country that's been in a crisis point for the last 18 months. So, some of this is spending that is, going to be justified. And we always are running up against that debt limit. I have to do it periodically. So I think ultimately it'll get figured out, but it's not necessarily going to throw everything off course immediately.
And with bonds selling at a all-time low interest rate, that's sort of a little bit of it alleviates the pressure a little bit on that debt too. So yeah, the government shutdown. It sounds like you're a bit optimistic on that. Then that cooler heads will prevail.
I like to think so. Things could change, but it doesn't seem like we're not facing a situation where there's been, well, I don't necessarily know for sure, but in the past, when we've had the government shutdown, it has been over a controversial issue, like building the border wall, or, something that's really a hang up and people are not going to budge on. I don't see that as much this time. So I'm pretty confident that we'll get a CR through December, mid-December, and just give more time. But again, the House has done quite a lot of work on their appropriations bills. The Senate has not. And so it's just a perpetual thing we face every year, that the work's not going to get done by September 30th. Yep. Usually cooler heads prevail. You get a continuing resolution. You don't have to go through the process of a government shutdown and all the pain that causes. So I guess I remain hopeful on that front.
We're sitting here in North Carolina. We're certainly not pointing fingers because we don't have a budget either at this level. So, it's
sure.
There's a lot of that going around, I'm afraid. So we've got a few minutes here to maybe look ahead to the longer term and the big picture. And I see Joe Milazzo asked a similar kind of question in the Q&A as well. Is it even possible to look ahead and look beyond, maybe even assume that these bills pass, and what's next in DC for transportation, looking ahead maybe to the rest of this Congress, or to the next Congress, the rest of the Biden first term. What are you kind of seeing?
Yeah, great question. If we can get through this and get a bill passed, I think that we'll go into a phase like we do after every, long-term reauthorization bill is passed, where there's new programs that got established, there's new policy to implement. So I think for sure ASHTO's focus will be on that. We've got to, and again, some of these things are really tied together. We really need the bill to pass so that we have some stability in the Highway Trust Fund. If we don't, we could be facing a shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund in the next few months. And Federal Highway Administration has been communicating on that to states. Contingency plans for cash management if it comes to that point. I don't think it's necessarily imminent, but it could happen. So the long-term issues, the big issues are still there. The reauthorization bill will buy us some time. So I think we'll be spending a lot of time interpreting the bill, figuring out all the new programs. The really robust discretionary spending that I mentioned earlier will be a huge focus of the administration, and it'll be a big focus for state DOTs as well. So we'll have plenty to keep us busy implementing a 5-year bill, multiple rulemakings, multiple, new guidance. It'll be a lot, and it'll be enough to keep us busy for sure. Beyond that, I think we'll hopefully return to a certain sense of normalcy and stability with our annual appropriation cycles and, the kind of day-to-day stuff. But certainly in our industry, there are huge challenges beyond, we've got a lot of technology challenges, connected and automated vehicles, revenue, electrification. There's plenty to focus on, and hopefully this infrastructure bill will help guide some of that work.
Good. So here's a kind of really big picture. To us on the outside, just kind of reading the headlines, Congress looks pretty broken at this point. The legislative process is not what we learned in civics class back in the day. And in fact, this, even some of us long for the days of earmarks and, that version of sort of broken Congress, but it seems like it's gotten even more so. Does it look different from the inside from where you're sitting, or can you give us a little bit of optimism that it's somehow still working?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, I think that for a long time, transportation people, we've patted ourselves on the back and thought of ourselves as being very bipartisan and able to, work together. And I do feel like some of that has eroded. It does feel more political. Um, One of the reasons that some people were so excited about bringing earmarks back is this thought that it would kind of help sweep people along to be engaged and interested in these transportation policy questions if they have a stake in it. They have a project that can be, beneficial to their district. So I try not to look through too much like rose-colored glasses. I mean, I kind of do look back romantically, quote unquote, to my time on the Hill. But there were still issues. I worked for Congressman David Price, who's very much an institutionalist and a scholar, and he always was very, I think, in tune to the changes underway in the institution. And as I think one of his primary goals was sort of keeping that spirit of bipartisan work, and the Appropriations Committee, which he serves on, is one of those places where that has traditionally happened. I do think some of that's eroded, and certainly on the transportation side, I think things have eroded a bit.
Mhm.
On the Senate, however, I mean, it's sort of a different story on the Senate side. I mean, you did get a bipartisan bill out of the Senate EPW committee. That meant it wasn't necessarily everybody's dream bill, but you give a little, you get a little. I do think there are pockets of that spirit of collaboration still around. And I think that the vast majority of members of Congress are there for the right reasons and trying to be public servants. So that's the kind of thing I try to focus on. But yeah, I guess, objectively things have changed, over time.
What moves the needle as far as crafting legislation, these big bills like this? The things we've noted so far in this hour is, President Biden has a thing for trains, and therefore rail gets funding, and then the chair of the House committee has his priorities,
yeah.
and they get funded. Is it really that personal, or are there other things that move the needle and get programs in a bill that gets passed?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a part of it. I mean, certainly like members' own interest, but also the times, I think, have an influence. I think, don't underestimate like President Biden being a product of the Senate, right? I mean, he believes in that institution very deeply. This wouldn't have all come to be the way it did without his influence and his really, I think, probably, completely true and faithful belief that the Senate can act as that kind of bipartisan body, that bipartisan institution. I think infrastructure rose on the agenda early because it has historically been bipartisan and of interest to all types of different people. There's a tie to the economy for sure. There's a tie to jobs for sure. There's a tie to quality of life. And then we have these sort of bigger issues in the world with climate and resilience that I think also demand some attention. And so infrastructure became, I think, a way to address a lot of things for a lot of people. And that's why I think I remain hopeful that we will get there, because so many different folks are invested in this for many different reasons. But yeah, so I think it's just kind of like I said, just sort of the right factors kind of came together that this became kind of a flagship initiative, and we've made this amount of progress. Really, I think an extraordinary amount of progress. Still not there at the finish line yet, but close. So I hope it doesn't all fall apart. I hope we are able to get there.
Yeah, no pressure. Just the fate of Western civilization writing in this, right?
Yeah.
It's well, and as you say, maybe rightfully so, but all of a sudden, a lot of things became focused on, us humble transportation.
I know. We've become internet famous, I guess. And the joke about Infrastructure Week, it's always Infrastructure Week.
Yeah.
We live with that kind of roller coaster ride for a long time, but things got serious pretty quickly here, and it was clear that this was going to be front and center. And so I feel like we were pretty well prepared, but it certainly has taken a lot of twists and turns that maybe we weren't fully expecting.
It's about 12:45. Reminder to our audience to please type in questions into the Q&A if you've got it. I see a few up there, and that's great. And If you add a few more, that would be really helpful. We'll address those in our last few minutes here. So please do type those in. How you work for AASHTO, so I think I know the answer to this, but how well is AASHTO's process working? And I work for a state DOT, so I'll say we are we having an influence there in the outcome?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to come and work for AASHTO is I don't think there's any more trusted voice when it comes to transportation at the national level. Now, there's plenty of stakeholders who are, very involved. Everybody from the contracting community to our public transit partners to, it goes on and on and on. It takes a lot, but we represent the practitioners. Our federal aid program can be complicated. We're a trusted resource, and we take that very seriously. And we really rely on our network of volunteers, state DOT volunteers, who help us develop policy and develop standards, and really can fulfill that duty, which we take very seriously, being the voice of the state DOTs and helping advance our transportation network. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly feel that way, and I enjoy representing, public sector partners very much.
Good. And I hope ITE is part of that.
Absolutely.
As well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good. I'm going to turn to a couple questions out of the Q&A at this point. So Robert asks, any thoughts on provisions in the IIJA that we are going to have to get used to that, to allow local jurisdictions to receive grants directly from US DOT?
Okay, that's a great question. I think the STBG stays, maybe the percentage goes up slightly. There's definitely some stuff in the budget reconciliation bill with local direct recipients of funding. I'll have to get back to you a little bit more in depth on. I don't think there's any new formula funding, like a dedicated, kind of source for locals. I think it's pretty much, it continues to be STBG. And then, as I said, perhaps in reconciliation, there will be some more targeted programs for locals. But I might want to circle back on that one to make sure I have all the details correct.
Okay. And if you email me, we'll post that on the website, on the Nixite website with the recording of this conversation. Okay. That'd be great. David Hyder makes a statement here. I'd like you to react to it. That and he's a thoughtful person that says he's come to the conclusion that it's just not feasible to totally remove politics from transportation decisions. That's welcome to.
Yeah, probably so. Yeah, I think I would agree. It's probably not possible to do it completely. I think, we've seen, North Carolina has undergone its own change in its prioritization process. A lot of states have done that to try to be as transparent with the public as possible. And then, at the federal level, certainly improvements could be made as well. But yeah, that's probably true. It's probably impossible. We got to strive for it. And again, I think the transparency part of it is the most important.
It's probably been that way for about 500 years too. So
yeah.
So another question from David Keelson, another one of our thoughtful members here. He heard in an earlier version of the bill that it would have put additional focus priority on operations versus infrastructure type spending.
Okay.
It's still true. What do you think?
Well, the only thing I'll say is that there are some nuances in the bill when it comes to what's the right terminology? Fix it first. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm not a performance person. I'm not a planning person. Yep. But there was certainly, particularly on the House side, a real emphasis in wanting state DOTs to demonstrate that they had exhausted all options for repairing and improving existing roadways before building new capacity. So I don't think as much of that ended up in the final bill. I mean, another area for me to follow up on, but certainly that was certainly a big focus of the House bill. And again, I think from AASHTO's perspective, we just didn't want anything that would be overly prescriptive and tie the hands of state DOTs too much. You have to keep in mind, you know, we represent 52 departments of transportation that are all very different. The beauty of our federal aid program is that it is flexible enough to meet those needs and desires. You know, depending on the needs of your state, the size of your program, the constituencies you serve. So we get a little bit antsy and nervous when too much prescription comes down at the federal level that we feel could tie people's hands. So, and I also think it's not a black or white issue when it comes to fix it. First, we have a lot of performance management standards that were implemented through the FAST Act. They're still being implemented. So, you know, I think some of that has to run its course.
Yeah, North Carolina happens to be a state that is still building new lanes, new roadway capacity to a large extent, and a lot of states have sort of moved on from that. So, you know, we have to have a bill that sort of, you know, allows states to be anywhere in that spectrum. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Good point. Good point. Andy, I'm not seeing anything. I can't see the chat. So are there good questions in there? All I see is the numbers building up there.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Ed Johnson had a question asking about funding for safe routes to school. Were there any insights related to this bill on that?
I don't think so. That's not what I'll have to get back with you on, because I don't want to speak out of turn, but I don't think so. Like, that used to be a formula program. Keep in mind, like, we, you know, a couple of bills ago dramatically reduced the number of core formula programs from like 30 or 40 or 50 something to down to like 7. So, you know, a lot of that got rolled into other flexibilities, whether it be CMAQ, whether it be transportation alternatives. So I don't think that the Safe Routes to School program exists as it previously did as a standalone program, and I don't think that that's been brought back. But I'll see what I can find, because there may be some language there that I've overlooked or some nuance to it. So I'll follow up on that one as well.
That'd be great. Again, we'll post whatever information you can find on the Nixite website next to the recording here. Any others, Andy? Catch your eye there?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we did have another question. This one, actually, we've got a couple now. This one's from Brian Pownall. He says, with the renewed emphasis on discretionary funds and those likely becoming more competitive in the future, do you see it becoming more challenging for smaller municipalities to get funding for local projects that may not score well enough on NCDOT's rubric?
Good question. I'm not sure how to predict how that will go. And I guess I would say, you know, localities may find themselves in an interesting position where some of this discretionary money maybe you may be eligible for. And if you know, if a locality feels like their priorities are not rising high enough on STIP, and they want to seek other ways of getting funding, you know, that's a calculus you have to make in terms of the cost and effort of working through a discretionary grant program. So yeah, I don't know, it's a good question. Like I said, I think how some of this discretionary funding is going to play out is going to be really interesting and complex. You know, at a minimum, we need to start, I think states need to start being prepared to play in that space if they haven't before. But yeah, the intersection between the local needs and how that plays in with federal discretionary dollars and the state needs, I think is like a big issue to be determined, probably.
And our legislature is probably going to have to weigh in on that too, to make sure that the small communities aren't just sort of rolled over in that process.
Right. Yeah. So there's probably an extra layer here in terms of governance at the state level that will be new.
Yeah. Very good. Let me draw us to a close here. We've got a couple minutes left. I know we have some younger members and hopefully some student members watching here. So any advice for our younger student members who want to sort of move into the transportation policy area in their career, like you have rather well? what should they do? What, what was the best thing that sort of launched your career in this area?
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, I kind of stumbled into transportation as a policy area, but I had always wanted to be a political or policy person since I was a young one, and knew I would move to Washington, D.C. as soon as I graduated from college, which is what I did. And then I had the great fortune to be able to work for a member of Congress, and that's where my interest in transportation kind of took off. So I think my advice would be pay attention to the news. If you want to get into policy work or political work, nothing beats an internship on Capitol Hill or with an association or with a lobbying firm, wherever it is. It really is, I think, a learn on the job type of endeavor. I'm really happy for all the political science classes I took, and even the other, having a well-rounded liberal arts education helped me tremendously. But there's really nothing like taking a chance and coming to DC or even coming to Raleigh. There's certainly obviously important work that happens at the state and even local level. So there's all levels of government to get involved in, whether it be directly political or just in the public policy space. But I do think that hands-on experience is really beneficial. Find people that will be willing to, most people are willing to talk about themselves or their jobs. So don't hesitate to ask for advice, find a mentor. And a lot of things will just kind of naturally come your way, I think.
And thank you for that. That's really, I think, good advice for those of our members. And last word, sort of, you're optimistic for the future of federal funding in transportation. It's hard to be optimistic these days, but it seems like you're managing that.
Yeah, I stay optimistic. I also think there's just a lot of transformation on the horizon. So it's kind of become a cliche to say it's an exciting time to be in transportation, but it really is. And we need folks who are really, I think, strong practitioners and who care about the details. That's one thing that I feel like makes me I'm certainly not the most qualified person in the world, but having worked for a state DOT, having seen the legislative side, and now working for an association, I understand some of the nuts and bolts, and that's what we really have to, I think, do a good job of communicating, that policy decisions matter, that it may not be the most exciting thing every day of the week, but the day-to-day operations of our transportation network are important to a lot of people's lives, everyone's life. So I think we should just lean into that kind of passion that we have as practitioners and do our best to build public trust and, share information. So I do remain optimistic, and I think that, again, if we get this legislative victory, it'll be a big benefit to all of us for years to come.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And thank you for the whole hour. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I think we could have gone another hour or two. Let's say have you back in January, maybe once we get the 3.5 trillion underway. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
Susan,
I'd be happy to. Thank you for the invitation.
Really appreciate it. Thanks to Andy, thanks to Christina and Adam, and all of our sponsored companies as well. Reminder to fill out your evaluation form to get your PDH certificate. And we're looking forward to one more conversation in early December, and hopefully it can be as good as this one, but we set the bar high here. Thanks a lot. I'm Joe Hummer, your NICSite president. Until next time, take care. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.